All right, welcome everyone to our Cyberwise Chat. So happy to have you here. I'm Diana Graber, author of Raising Humans in a Digital World and founder of Cyberwise and Cybercivics. Here as always with Dr. Pamela Rutledge, who is the director of the Media Psychology Research Center. And we are so excited to welcome back Dino Ambrosi. He's been with us before. He is the founder of Project Reboot, which is a really incredible program that he's going to tell you more about. But basically, he is aiming at helping the next generation build empowering relationships with technology. And we've talked to Dino before about this, and it's been just such a pleasure to watch his organization grow and impact more and more students, not just in the US, but around the world. So before I jump into today's topic, I'd like to just turn it over to Dino just for a few moments. If you could summarize what it is you do, and from there, we'll take it to what you've been seeing out there with the kids you've been talking to.
Yeah. Well, first off, super happy to be back. Thank you for having me. And yeah, just to add a little bit more color to the overview that you gave, my main focus is to work with students to help them develop intentional relationships with technology. So my approach is very non-prescriptive. I don't think there is a right relationship to have with screens or social media. And I often find that when we tell kids how to use it, we get met with rolled eyes and they kind of shut down. So I instead just try to come into schools and deliver assemblies where I speak openly about the struggles that I had personally with my relationship with technology, give them a little bit of context and information that I wish that I had known when I was in middle school or high school, and then just provide them with a framing for them to figure out their own intentions for how they want to use it, along with resources to actually bring that ideal into reality. So most of what I do is speak at schools through assemblies and parent presentations. I also have a program that tacks on to those assemblies to help incite this kind of cultural shift among the student body that makes it easier to be intentional online. Because one of the biggest challenges that students face is the role of the cultural norms among the student body on their own use of social media. And that's something that you can't solve through a tech policy or a lecture. It actually has to come from them. So I really try to be a catalyst for a shift in the way that students view their relationship to social media and the norms that kind of drive how they use it with each other.
Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you know what I really love about what you're doing is that in order to be intentional, you have to think about your goals.
Yes.
And that's not something we often do with kids with media and technology. We don't say, well, why are you doing? What are you trying to do? We're just like, what are you doing? And so I think that's such an important thing, not just for technology use, but as a maturation skill, right? They need to learn how to think about their goals in order to make all kinds of decisions. So I really love that about your focus.
What else?
So let's start.
I just wanted to say, before you ask your question, Pam, so the other thing that really jumped out at me, in fact, I wrote it down, is it has to come from them. And that is, that cannot be said enough, because there's so many of us that work in this industry giving lectures to kids or talking to the parents or sending curriculum that they just like to like this through. And none of that works. It's got to be like a more holistic approach. And the kid has to be at the center of that. Like, students have to talk to each other about these topics. Like, I don't care what. We could talk our heads off to the parent community, and that's not going to change anything. But when they create those norms together and kind of muddle through this really complex world that they're growing up in, that's when change happens. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I agree. I think it's super important.
The top level question, what's your big takeaway from what you see now versus when we talked to you a couple of years ago? What are you seeing out there that's different or the same?
I think the biggest shift that I've seen is kids are really waking up to the fact that this is an issue, and the level of receptiveness of the student audiences that I've spoken to and the desire to get involved in seeing this shift happen has really grown immensely. It's far surpassed my expectations. We have students that have reached out to me from schools all over the country and even the globe about getting involved in Project Reboot and starting clubs. We have university clubs starting at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, Berkeley, Cal Poly, NYU, potentially Stanford and ASU as well. And then high school clubs are starting as well. And there's just this immense push and momentum that I'm seeing from students to make this shift happen. I think they're starting to have this conversation more with each other, and the struggle with screen time is becoming less kind of stigmatized, and they're becoming more willing and open to talk about it with each other. That's not categorically true. There are still challenges that are there, but I'm really seeing some momentum starting to build in a way that it just wasn't really there when I started doing this work a few years ago. So it's been very encouraging for me to see.
That's good. I wonder, I hear kids embracing this term addiction a lot, in ways that a mental health professional would not categorize it as addiction. And my interpretation is that they're feeling a lack of control.
Yes.
And not just it, I mean, then the technology is almost a mediator of what they're feeling out of control is, their social world, or in other words, it's hard to balance. You're sort of a rock and a hard place, right? Hard to balance technology use when it's the portal to all of the social activity, and you're a teenager at that developmental period where that's a really, important thing and exciting thing for you to be doing. So how do you talk with kids about that shift from something's wrong with me, I'm addicted, to making choices?
Yeah, I think a big challenge that students face is it is really easy to feel shame around this, or like you are the reason that you're struggling with it, right? And a huge part of what my message is it's not just you. The vast majority of people are struggling with this to a certain extent, and that's because of deeper issues, right? It's because of the ways that the apps are designed and the cultural norms that have been created that make it difficult for us to use them intentionally. And the diffusion of that shame, I think, is extremely important, because one of the biggest drivers of unintentional tech use is actually self-loathing. This is something that I'm starting to hear more and more from students is I find myself getting pulled into these rabbit holes where I'm staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning because I'm running away from this conversation with myself about my inability to control my use of these devices, right? I've realized, oh man, I've been on this for an hour now. I should have been working, or I should have been asleep already. And that leads to this very negative inner monologue that's very uncomfortable. And they run away from that discomfort by ignoring it, by continuing to scroll. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if addiction is the right word for that. I'd say there's widespread, chronic, unintentional use of technology despite significant consequences that they realize, and they have a desire to change how they use it. But for a number of reasons, it's a challenge for them to do so.
I wanted to dig into something you said earlier, because you said that you see the issues changing. And I know, especially when you started this work, it was really a lot about screen time and, how to manage that. But I think there's a lot more going on now. At least that's what I'm seeing with kids. They're not just worried about screen time. They're worried about a lot of other things too. So I wonder if you're picking up on that as well. And if you are, what are the other concerns they're having about what's happening out there in technology?
Yeah, I mean, one common thread that I'm hearing from students is just an enormous amount of overwhelm regarding the desire to be productive and get more done. And I actually think that a lot of the unintentional use and the fleeing that they engage in, where they turn to a screen, is downstream of an unfulfilled desire for play and for legitimate breaks. Like, we can't always be productive. And a lot of the conversations I'm having with students, especially at these, very rigorous schools where there's a huge focus on college applications and always having more extracurriculars and more clubs and taking all of the APs and studying for your SATs and ACTs is the loop that's constantly running in their head is like, how do I do more? How does what I'm doing right now lead to this better future or make me more likely to get into these schools? And they neglect the importance of taking legitimate restorative breaks, which you need to do, especially if you're doing things related to knowledge work or learning. Like, we cannot always be striving for something in the future. We need to learn to take time to relax and recharge and have some level of enjoyment and satisfaction in our lives. And when I feel that when that's neglected, it manifests in less intentional ways, right? So I think that's another really common thread that I'm starting to see from them.
That's interesting, because that means that this, I mean, if I'm hearing you right, the preoccupation with the use of the device, and screen time is sort of the proxy of that, isn't leaving room for thinking about how are the algorithms changing how I think about myself, or how are they persuading me into purchasing things, or how is this information framed in a way that I believe it. You know, all of these things that are sort of critical thinking about content issues. If you're emotionally overwhelmed, you're not even going there.
Yeah. You just don't care. It's serving the purpose of being an escape. And even if you're aware of the fact that it's problematic and that there is disinformation out there and that it is affecting your attention span and all of these things, if it is the thing that you turn to avoid challenges or various forms of discomfort, that awareness isn't enough, right? And it's not something that you're thinking through critically. You're kind of turning to it reactively.
Yeah, and that's really a problem when there's stuff, as we know, kids are getting current events and news on their devices. So much misinformation, disinformation out there. I mean, are you hearing them worry about that at all? Is it just like you say, going in one ear and out the other, and they just accept it, or do they just not accept it? Are they skeptical of everything? I mean, I'm just so curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, it's not a major area of focus for me. I'm much more honed in on your relationship with the screen as something that are you running towards it with a purpose, or are you using it to run away from something else? And I think the whole mis and disinformation conversation is more of like a digital literacy, digital citizenship thing, whereas I'm much more focused on the digital wellness side. So it's not a conversation that I have very often with students. I know that some of them view it as a concern, but others, I don't know. It doesn't come up in the dialogues that I have with them very frequently.
I'll poke back at you and say it is a wellness issue.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
My view, I think a lot of, we hear kids being depressed and mental problems and all that. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that they're seeing so much stuff that is concerning, and some of it's not even true on their devices, that's leading them to feel worried or anxious. So it's also wrapped up with each other. And gosh, how do we prepare kids for all of these things? Not just the time that they're spending with their devices, but the things they're seeing in their devices and how they're using devices and what algorithms are doing. I mean, it's a lot. I can understand why kids feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, I wonder too. We've got a question down there. We should look.
Oh, look while you talk.
Okay. But the just focusing on the intentional use of technology, there's been this big push lately for like Australia banning social media for under 16, and cell phone bans, and all of these sort of suppression approaches to technology management. And as you know, I always get to my goat that they don't bother to include teaching kids how to use it well. But I know you've had some experience with talking with kids about this and some thoughts about whether or not this stuff is worth anything.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing this up. I think it's a very important conversation to have right now. I think we're at this really critical cultural moment where there's a lot of momentum around this topic, and it does dishearten me to see the default response in so many places be this kind of knee jerk, we're banning and restricting, and that's going to be our approach. That's not to say that it can't be helpful. And I actually think in schools where students are younger, I think you could make the argument up through eighth grade that not having phones at all on campus could be a really effective thing, largely because it protects that social environment during breaks. And I think there's a strong argument for keeping students off of full on smartphones until high school. I don't think that they shouldn't have access to the internet, but we need to kind of give them an on ramp into the online world. And when all of their friends are on it and they're legitimately missing out on updates because their friends are using Snapchat to talk and they don't have Snapchat, that's a problem. So in that case, like restriction can be a useful thing, but especially in high schools, we need to prepare students to live life with a phone in their pocket. It's always going to be there. And I think that there are some enormous unintended consequences that I'm not really seeing get discussed quite enough in just taking this banning approach. So for one, as I talked about earlier on, like an enormous factor in how students use devices is the cultural norms among the student body. And when you take this kind of top down, we're just going to take these away from you approach, you typically have a negative impact on those cultural norms. It actually kind of becomes this anti-authority, socially credited thing to go seek digital distraction. And I've heard anecdotally from students and administrators at schools that have implemented phone bans, there are a lot of cases where students will put a second phone in the pouch, or they will purchase magnets online that can be used to unlock the pouches, and then they'll sell them at a markup on campus. And they start these underground magnet like black markets on campus, which is very entrepreneurial, but obviously has this this effect of it's kind of becomes cool to find ways to get around the restriction and use it to distract yourself. I've also heard from students that it leads to worse screen time outside of school. And that's something that's not really visible from the perspective of a teacher or a school administrator. But I think the most problematic screen time is when students are procrastinating on homework or lying in bed and staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning. And when you just take this, we're getting rid of it approach, it sends some negative messages, I think, to students. For one, it like explicitly identifies this phone as an addictive toy that doesn't have, productive purposes and benefits. And furthermore, is something that the school doesn't believe that you have the capability to use responsibly, right? And that just implicitly sends a message to students that I don't think is healthy, especially when you realize that a lot of students are internally struggling with this quite a lot, are having this conversation of like, why am I staying up so late on this thing? Why can I not control my relationship with it? And then the school basically affirms that and says, yeah, you're right, you can't, so we're taking it. And then, yeah, lastly, they're going to go off to college, right? They're going to have this eventually. And at the end of the day, it's really not the phone so much that's the issue, it's the internet. And if you have Chromebooks or iPads, or students are using laptops on campus, there are many other ways to engage in digital distraction. So it's just not a solution. It needs to be paired with education and resources and empowerment in order to really be effective.
Amen.
Absolutely, yeah, and I love that emphasis on, we're just setting them up for the other 17 hours a day when their phone isn't in a bag. But I love all the ways that they work around it, because nothing makes something attractive to a teenager more than telling them they can't have it.
We are literally raising the greatest generation of hackers.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
every kind of restriction, they find a way around it. Like kids are downloading VPNs. They're like jailbreaking their
Five burners, put them in the back pocket. I mean, duh,
It's
they're
amazing.
good at this stuff. No ban has ever worked. I mean, kids will find a way around them. It's crazy. Hey, I wanted to get to one. We have a bunch of questions here, but I wanted to get to one that I think is a really good one. I'd like to hear if Dino has heard students talking about how technology is changing the way their romantic relationships work.
Ooh, yes. I have heard this. Yeah. And this is interesting because it's something that's changed pretty significantly from when I was in high school. And, we had Snapchat and other forms of social media, and there was definitely uh, romantic interests were a factor in how you used it. But I think Snapchat in particular has done a really, well, I don't want to say they've done a good job. I think it's kind of evil what they've done, but they've figured out how to position themselves well to become this kind of uh, intermediary between students in a romantic way that keeps them coming back to the app more and more. So a few things that make Snapchat um, this kind of dating app that students turn to. One, it's really easy to find someone on Snapchat because you can just search their name, right? So whereas when I was growing up, it was you had to ask someone for their number, which feels a lot more formal and like I'm trying to start a conversation with you in that way. You can just add them on Snapchat and you can kind of slowly start the conversation with them. And I've heard from students that there have been relationships that have fully started that way. So it's not starting with a conversation on campus. It's adding someone on Snapchat and then slowly starting to comment on their story and engage in a conversation and all of these things. And that's not to say that's inherently a bad thing. I mean, I think that this is a very different conversation, but I think there's benefits to getting over the fear of starting that conversation in person. But when you pair it with the way that Snapchat has kind of engineered these interactions through the Snapchat streaks and giving students the option to pay money to see who everyone's best friends on Snapchat are and whether or not they've opened your message or if they've responded to other messages since you've sent them a message and the snap maps and all these things, it leads to this very like neurotic social environment where students feel like they need to respond to messages really quickly. Otherwise, that sends a signal that like, oh, I'm no longer interested in you, or we need to have our streak going because if that streak breaks, it signifies the end of a relationship. So it's really changed the way that romantic relationships start and develop over time. And conveniently for Snapchat, it's centered around them coming back over and over and over again. So yeah, great question. It's really interesting. I just had a fascinating conversation with a student about that.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you're identifying here is how different aspects of technology become symbolic of something else, right?
Yeah.
Banning phones tells kids they don't know how to use a phone. The way Snapchat has set some of this up, who did you respond to, the streak and all that is a way of triggering all those social anxieties that we all have, the social comparison, and it really leans into those. So that makes all of these little seem like innocuous things like a streak turn into having this really big meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to. We have a lot of comments mostly people are just saying that they're enjoying this and they're kind of going on about some of the things you said, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But I do want to, something we haven't talked about that's really big right now is AI. And I want to,
Yeah.
I mean, new things are coming out every single day and it's really changing our experience with technology and a lot of, how we search, everything, how we write. And are you hearing from kids about that? And they feeling the pressure of AI? Are they interested in using the tools or is it changing the way they're using technology at all?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a few different conversations to have about this. I want to start by acknowledging the positives. I use AI on a daily basis, and I think it has so much potential to really positively impact our lives, both online and offline. Like one thing I've started doing is on a monthly basis, I have a conversation with ChatGPT where I tell it the things that I'm working on, what I'm trying to focus on for the next month. some of the pieces of content that I've consumed over the last month, books that I've been reading, things like this. And I collaboratively work with it to develop basically a menu of content that I can consume for the rest of the month. And it gives me all these links to TED Talks and YouTube videos and podcast episodes and books and documentaries and all these things that balance out the content that I'm consuming online and make sure that I'm not missing out on perspectives that will expand my worldview and give me kind of a more nuanced perspective on whatever it is that I'm thinking about for that month. So even just simple things like that, right? Like there's so many ways in which it can really positively impact the way that we interact with the internet. But I think a major challenge for students is they have this ability to delegate critical thinking. And it's something that I think we take for granted as people that grew up without AI. Like we didn't have a way to do that. We had to develop our ability to think critically on our own. And now we can pair that critical thinking and all of those skills with this amazing tool. But one of the core principles of how tools work, I can't remember who said this, maybe it was Marshall McLuhan. I know that they mentioned this quote in the book The Shallows that I think is really powerful. Whatever technology amplifies, it also amputates, right? Like when you use a tool to enhance something, it makes your innate capability in that thing worse. So running shoes make your feet weaker, right? And they can still be beneficial. It allows you to run all over, rocks and pebbles and whatnot, but we don't have the same calloused feet and resilience to where we can go for a run barefoot now. Google Maps has made it much harder for me to navigate on my own. I'm completely helpless without it. I've become totally reliant. I think a similar thing happens with our writing capabilities. And I want to caution this with saying, like, I haven't done a super deep dive on this yet, so I'm kind of speculating here. And I think there's definitely more research to be done. But I just have to imagine that if you have this way to quickly complete homework without really diving into it and grappling with it, it's just not going to be a good thing for your capacity to think critically. So I think that's a major concern. And I've heard from some students that they're recognizing that, and that in some ways they wish that they didn't have it, because it's like when this shortcut is so clear and it's right there, like, how are you not going to take it, is how a lot of them feel. But they're also starting to realize this negative impact of, the weakening of the feet for the running shoe analogy. So I think in that aspect, it's a bit of a mixed bag.
That's interesting too, Dino, because you were talking earlier about how kids are feeling overwhelmed by all of this stuff they have to do. And then you give them a tool that facilitates something, but you haven't taught them how to use that tool. Right. You haven't taught them that they have to actually check the references or check the facts. In other words, you can take something that ChatGPT wrote and use critical thinking to edit it and still learn, right? In other words, but we've set them up so that they feel like they have to do all these things. And then we're saying, no, don't use that tool that will really speed things up for you, because that's bad. So I think that there's, we're giving kids, again, these very difficult conflicting messages about the tools and our expectations about them.
Right. And that's why I asked, like, what are kids feeling? Because what I'm seeing is it's happening so fast, and schools don't move fast, and so teachers are like trying to figure out how to use it themselves. And then they haven't been told what's okay and what's not okay for students. And so students aren't getting any guidelines. And, if I were a seventh grader and I didn't want to write a paper, I'd certainly go to ChatGPT and have it do it.
For sure.
You'd be crazy not to. But I think until we give kids those intermediary steps, that's something we've really worked hard to do in cyber civics, to say, hey, this is what generative AI is. This is some ways to use it, that it's really good. It's going to help you, but you still have to do these steps. So I think as a generation, it's going to take us a minute to catch up to where the technology is. And boy, I wish schools luck to get there before their students get there before them. So
go
ahead. And then I'll ask.
I was just going to quickly add, like, I feel like what's going to need to happen is the whole model of how education works is going to kind of have to flip. And this isn't an idea that I came up with. I read about this in a book called Co-Intelligence. Have either of you heard of the inverted classroom model?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes. So for anyone that isn't familiar with this, it's basically the idea that um, AI could really change education by forcing us to kind of shift from this model of in class time, this is when you receive information, right? You're going through a lesson, you're getting introduced to new concepts. You're basically doing a form of content consumption in the classroom. And then you go home and you wrestle with that content and complete activities and exercises and write essays and all of these different things. What could happen is AI could enable the model to flip such that content consumption is happening at home with this AI tutor that is disseminating the content at the student's level, at the rate at which they're responding to it. And they just have to go through their homework is to go through basically this interactive content consumption. And then they go into class, and that's where they do discussions and write essays and go through activities and things like this in a controlled environment where we can ensure AI is not being used as a shortcut. So I think that's kind of where things are probably going to need to go. Again, I'm speculating a little bit here. This isn't my area of expertise, but I think it actually could open up a really powerful new model of education that could be super beneficial for students as well.
It's going to take a minute.
I agree. There's an interesting question here about someone whose student was seventh grade during COVID, and one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll finish the rest of her question his question, is COVID happened during a very critical developmental period for an awful lot of kids. And so I'm wondering if they're aware of how COVID affected them, whether they talk about it or if that's like, 3 years ago, like, dude, that's ancient history, whether they're aware of any changes that in their technology use or in their social abilities.
Yes. Yeah.
Because of COVID.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something I consistently hear when I ask students about the story of their relationship with their screens. It's like COVID is this turning point, right? And it leads to much more like turning to technology as escapism and kind of as like a means of feeling like you are connected. And this actually leads me into kind of a different point that I want to make that I think will be helpful for advancing how we think about the way that students relate to social media. One thing that I hear from a lot of parents when I do parent presentations or from people that are advocates for going, full phone free in schools, it's this line of thinking of like, we don't let them use cocaine. We don't like give them drugs and other forms of narcotics. Like this stuff is a drug. Like why would we give it to them? Right. We don't allow them to set their own intentions around alcohol consumption. Like we know what the negative impacts are. How could you argue that it makes any sense to have these drugs sitting in our kids' pockets while they're on campus? Like it's our responsibility to take them away. We can't expect them to be able to handle their relationship with a drug like this. And my response to that is like, it's not a drug, right? The much better analogy is it's like your diet, right? There are very nutritious aspects of the internet and technology use out there, but it comes with a bunch of candy. Like there's all of these sweets that are also sitting there in the pantry. And I've heard from students that it is just this mixed bag when it comes to socializing. In some ways, it's such a powerful tool for helping them maintain relationships with people that move to another school, or if they moved themselves and have people that they want to stay in touch with. Like there's all these amazing ways to maintain that. But it also has given them this pathway for feeling like they are socially connected without exerting any effort to actually develop a connection. Like when they're sitting there and they're watching these vlogs or videos of people talking directly into a camera on a social media feed, it feels like you're having a conversation with that person, right? Subconsciously, you're getting that same kind of dopamine release of the the pleasure of connecting to someone, but it's not a connection because it's a one-way street, right? And it doesn't lead to the feeling of satisfaction that you get from genuinely having deep positive connections with other people. And this is a point that I'm really starting to see students wake up about. Like my main kind of protege, young grasshopper, this kid Dawson, that was one of the first students that I taught. He now teaches the course that I taught at UC Berkeley that started Project Reboot. He's starting a Project Reboot club. He's actually created a whole deck of conversation cards to help people in his generation develop better connections with each other, because he and his friends are recognizing that they've lost the ability to really go deep and have vulnerable conversations, because that has largely been replaced by this like facsimile of connecting mediated by the internet. And that started with COVID, or it was at least majorly accelerated by COVID. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think that's kind of the perspective that students have on it.
And I think you sort of answered, but the
it's
rest of that woman's question was, what is your advice to stop this cycle? And you more or less answered it. And I may jump in here real quick and say, I think a couple ways that you could break it in high school is like having Dino come speak to a high school is very powerful because he's lived this experience. And I think kids relate to that. And then number two, and Dino does this and we do it through cyber civics, is teaching kids about algorithms and all the persuasive technologies that companies use to grab and hold on to their attention. That's super powerful. Kids, honestly, the ones I teach in middle school, they're kind of shocked when they learn about all these really crazy techniques that are used to manipulate them. And I think that knowledge, and that's Dino speaks to that, and I'm going to shut up here in a minute, but I think kids knowing that about that is super powerful, because knowledge is power and kids need to know that they're being manipulated by their devices. Would you agree, Dino?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that knowledge is super important. I think it needs to be supplemented by a more structured approach that they should take. Like one of the challenges that I've had to figure out is, when I first started doing these assemblies and talking to students, I was talking about all the benefits of reducing screen time and weaning yourself off of the dependence to digital distraction. And the most common question that I got was, okay, so I can see that I should spend less time on screens. What do you want me to do? Like, how am I supposed to fill this time? Right? What's the alternative? It can't just be a less of this. Like these companies are manipulating you and like you need to be aware of all of this stuff and you're paying for it with your time and just make sure you're getting a good deal. It needs to be that tailored with here's what you should do instead, right? When you are feeling stressed out or burnt out or lonely or whatever all these things are, here's a menu of alternative behaviors that you can engage in that will actually be beneficial to you. And I think a huge component of that is authentic, deep social connection. And we need to work as parents, adults, educators that interact with these students to make it easier for that to happen, right? This is the one like really beneficial thing about doing a phone ban is that you can actually create this environment at lunch where students don't really have a choice but to engage with each other face to face. I just think we need to try to create that without blindly restricting them and taking the phones away. And a lot of students want that. Like deep down, they really want that, right? So it needs to be paired with this conversation of the reason that you're so drawn to this thing is because you are a social being that wants to connect with people, right? And we need to strive to work towards that. And it has to be this collective effort that kids need to be involved in. And I think how you approach it with them, the conversation really needs to be collaborative. So my like go-to question that I ask students, as opposed to what's your current screen time or how do you feel about your time on Instagram or whatnot, it's just how happy are you with your relationship with your phone, right? And getting them to open up and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, like most students answer a 2 or a 3. So there's a room for improvement there, right? And exploring with them, like, well, why is it not a five? And like, what could we do to get it to a five? What are the obstacles that are in the way? And viewing it as this kind of collaborative effort to work with them to make their relationship with it a 5 out of 5, where they are totally happy with how they're using it. And if you approach that conversation in a way that doesn't make them feel judged or talked down to, or, it's not condescending, it's really amazing how many students are open about the fact that they want to see this change.
And I want to just add on that because, oops,
go.
I'm sorry.
After you.
What happens during middle school developmentally is a really important acquisition of a lot of social skills. Mm-hmm. And so COVID, what the technology during COVID kept people feeling connected, and that was really important. And in fact, kids who were able to do that ended up much better positioned mental health wise than kids who were not. However, that doesn't build the skills that they used to have. So if someone's having a hard time transitioning from COVID level social media use to not COVID, I would say that's a point of compassion to say, okay, I'm guessing that there's some skill development that needs to happen here. So let's not say you don't have the skills, but let's say, what is it that you're on there for? Figuring out those goals that you talked about with your intentionality, and then doing the sort of bit by bit, how do you make little changes? Because the most sustainable changes over time are small changes that people can buy into and do. So maybe if they're on the phone for 4 hours a day, you go back to 3.5, and then you talk about what's the difference and what are you doing instead, and all these things that you're talking about. But I think recognizing that this wasn't just a phone that came in and sucked up their brains, but that there are actually some skills that didn't get developed because of the isolation, not because of the technology. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's important to differentiate those things so that you're not blaming the wrong, cowboy.
That's a great point. I mean, you guys bring up such great advice for parents here, and I might throw in one other piece of advice, and it's something that we do in cyber civics with the middle school students when we're about to have them go on a tech break. Because like you mentioned, Dino, kids often say, well, what am I supposed to do with myself? Like, I'm going to go crazy. And so our previous activity to that is the bucket list. So we have kids pretend it's a world in which no digital technology exists. What would be, 25 things on your bucket list that you would love to do? And so kids get really imaginative. I'd love to learn how to do this or play the guitar, learn how to knit, whatever. And so then when they go off the device and they start complaining to the parents, like, oh my gosh, I'm so bored, I've got nothing to do, pull out that bucket list, make it a game. How many of these can we check off before your digital detox is over? So I don't know how effective that will be as kids get older. I would imagine it would still work. Their bucket list might become even better. But I know with kids that we've tried it with, it really helps to give them an alternative. And what I've learned doing that lesson for so many years is this is a generation, as you know, Dino, they do not know life without phones.
Yeah.
It's just the default go-to for boredom. And so unless we give them an alternative, it's going to remain that. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a couple things to tack onto this, like really specific pieces of advice that I have for parents in particular. It amazes me how aligned the intentions are between students and parents and how they want to use technology. Like when I start my presentation, I have this graph that shows an 18-year-old's remaining time in months. And I add in, this is how many are going to go to sleep and work and school and all these chores and errands and stuff. You're left with 334 months of remaining free time, optimistically, assuming a life expectancy of 90. And I show that graph at the start of the talk to parents, and I show it at the start of the talk to students. And I ask both audiences, what deserves the largest chunk of that free time? How do you want to spend it? And the answers are like almost identical. It's time with friends. It's traveling and exploring. It's pursuing hobbies and passions and interests. It's doing things that bring you enjoyment. And I've never had a student say TikTok. That has never been the number one answer or the thing that comes to mind for them. And if you, again, approach this conversation with them in this collaborative way, where you frame it just as them making their own decisions and setting their own goals around how they want to use their time, you can shift from being a judge that imposes rules on them without their consent to being a guide that helps them figure out how they want to use it and holds them accountable to that ideal. Right. And just starting with like, let's look at your weekly schedule. Right. How much free time do we have outside of school? Okay, we have this many hours, right? Now, what do we want to do with this time? And I love that idea of the bucket list, right? Prompting them to think about if screens were not there, what would be the top things they would want to do? Listing that out and getting a general sense of like, in the context of all of this, what is your ideal amount of daily average non-productive screen time, right? And how would you kind of budget that between the different apps that are available? And they'll back themselves into a very reasonable set of goals for how they want to use it. And now you are in a position to basically just say, okay, that's awesome. It seems like you've really thought through it. Like I'd love to do what I can to help you use it well. Because personally, I struggle with it sometimes, right? Like being vulnerable and saying, I got sucked down a Facebook rabbit hole the other day, or sometimes I spend more time on YouTube than I want. And I think it'd be really awesome if we like held each other accountable and shared screen time reports or whatnot. I think that's a very helpful way to approach the problem. And then the other thing is sometimes the best move is to approach it indirectly, right? So as you're talking about, Pam, it's not so much the screens, it's the skills or the lack of skills. And as opposed to saying you need to be on your phone less, say, I'd love to set things up so that you're connecting with friends more, right? Maybe we can set up, I don't know, like a group activity in the park this weekend, or instead of, scrolling through TikTok on your own as you're lying in bed, like what if we did a family movie night every week and we invited some friends over and all consumed like longer form, better content together and then had a conversation about it, right? Like those are often the best ways to approach it. Because if it's this negative, like we need less of this, it can kind of make them feel defensive. But if it's a positive, like, ooh, let's have more of this, right? They're more drawn to it.
There is a question I'd love to, in the limited time we have left, ask you real quick here. What are your thoughts on companion and character AI and vulnerable youth?
Ooh, great question. Ah, yeah, it's nuanced because I think, again, it has the potential to be a tool that can kind of help them explore how they develop connections and relate to other people. And if that companion can also kind of be an assistant, I think it has the potential to be a positive thing. But I think it's really important to put this conversation in perspective by looking at the arc that social media took. Because the stage that character AI and replica and all of these AI companions are in right now is where social media was in 2007, right? The first goal that social media companies had was let's dominate the market by building up our user base, right? So they built the apps that everyone wanted. The first version of Facebook was a tool explicitly to connect with people. The first version of Instagram was a digital scrapbook to share memories with friends. They focused on adding value for the users so that they could get more users and therefore make it harder to leave, right? The reason that students don't want to shift off of Snapchat is because all of their friends are on Snapchat. They have this network effect that makes them sticky and allows them to monetize by changing the app to be something that we didn't sign up for, right? Now, social media in a lot of ways is more entertainment than it is social. If you scroll through Instagram, the first 20 posts you see, more than half will be from people that you don't even know. And a lot will be from accounts you don't follow. So as they started to monetize, their goals changed. And I think that's really important to remember because when we look at how all of these, character AI and whatnot are going to evolve, right now they are really just trying to build the best AI companion that they possibly can. They have the user's goals in mind, but eventually the one that wins and that builds the best model is going to be free because they'll be able to have the largest set of users and get the best data set to make that model better. Once they have a large enough group, they're going to start monetizing. And they're not going to do it by charging people money. They're going to do it by changing the goals of the companion. And I think that's a really critical thing to understand because they will be better positioned to influence and manipulate people than any other company in the world. They'll understand you psychologically so deeply well because they've had all of these conversations with you. And eventually, if it's video chat and they're reading your facial expressions and all of these things, like they will really know on a deep psychological level what makes you tick. And if all of a sudden the goals of that thing shift and it's trying to sell you things or change your opinions or whatnot, it's going to be hard to see that happening. And it's going to be really hard to leave, because in the same way that we didn't want to switch off Snapchat and Instagram because our friends are there. Well, now this thing is your best friend or it is your romantic partner. Leaving and going to a different one is like killing that friend, right? So you'll be even more stuck to it. So that's the risk that I see. And I would just say at this point, like AI should be an assistant. It should be a tool. It should not be a replacement. It should not be your best friend. Really purely because of how I think it will inevitably evolve as it starts to monetize. I just think it's really risky.
It's so funny. I'm just thinking here that episodes of Dark Mirror are starting to write themselves.
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
Pretty crazy. And we actually just finished doing a video for Cyber Civics on character AI. So it's a whole new section that we're adding next year on healthy relationships. So stay tuned.
Wow, exciting. That's awesome.
Yeah. Pam, did you want to address that last question? We just have probably time for
No,
that.
I think Dino covered it really well. And I think that it goes back to all the things that you're trying to do in Cyberwise and that you're trying to get people aware of too, Dino, is this sort of being smart about what you're using, understanding the technology, not just blindly, following where no man has gone before. So that when you're having these conversations with kids, the what if kind of question is a very powerful, what if this happened? Well, what if it could do that? What if it could do that? Well, how would that be? And then it depersonalizes it, especially if you use someone else as the example and not your child, so that you can take them through some of these scenarios that you're talking about so that they're aware of this potential. Because I think, to me, this all boils down to fundamentally awareness of what's happening when you're online. I mean, obviously you have to do what you're talking about, Dino, is you have to figure out what you want to do and be intentional. But part of that intention in spending your time is knowing what's happening on these different platforms and where it really is supporting your goals and where it could be leading you someplace that's less productive.
And I love what both of you are saying, because it's really a student-centered approach. It's us, not top down, take away the device. You have to do it this way. These are the right amount of hours for you. It's really looking at the student and what their needs are and the way they're already using technology and how they can make that better. So love that approach. Dino, we have a few more minutes left. We've actually gone way over our usual half hour, but you've been so wonderful to talk to. I wonder if you could just summarize the biggest takeaways that you've gotten from students out there in a way that might help the viewers that are watching today.
I would say
no pressure.
Yeah.
The big last words.
Yeah, it's a lot to condense, but I would say we have to work with them, right? We can't work against them and try to control them. And the good news is they have the potential to be great partners as we try to navigate this as a society. They want what's best for themselves. They want to have good connections and relationships. They want to be successful, right? And if we trust them to have a voice in this and actually take their own best interest into their own hands, and develop that ability to navigate the online world in a powerful way where they're getting the benefits without the drawbacks, I think we're much better positioned to move forward in a positive way than if we don't trust them and we feel that we need to just blindly restrict them.
Excellent. Well said. Pam, what are your big takeaways today?
I'm frozen.
Oh, you're frozen, or am I frozen?
No, I seem to be I try not to take it personally when my computer tells me I'm unstable. No, I just want to reiterate, the big point that Dino's been making is that this has to be student centric. It has to be approached with some compassion, understanding. Their world is so different, even from what you grew up with, Dino, and I'm older than you. So different from what we grew up with, that you have to allow their experience to help guide this process, and trust that once they understand that you're supporting their goals, not just making rules, that they will want to have a voice, especially when you contextualize it in the way that you've been doing, Dino, showing them the expenditure of hours and making them feel like they're in control again, which is what I think all of this addiction talk from kids, is about, is this sense of lack of control in a world that feels very out of control.
Yeah, and I think words are so important, Pam. When we talk about student-centered here, a lot of times what they're hearing from adults is, you're addicted, you have a problem, what are we going to do about this? And those are the wrong words. It's not an addiction, really. It's like maybe problematic use, but let's talk about why they're using it and how they're using it. And I think taking it back to that child and what their needs are is just so helpful to all of us. It's going to destigmatize, that feeling of addiction. I have a problem. So I love that. And I hope that that's our big takeaway from today. Dino, thank you so much as always for being here. I want to make sure that everyone knows how they can find you and get in touch with you. So if you could take a moment and give us that information.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is projectreboot.school. And if you just go there, you'll see all the information on the work that I do with schools. If you want to set up a time to chat, there's a button in the top right. You can book a call with me, and feel free to reach out to me via email at dino@projectreboot.school.
And if you don't have a pen with you, tomorrow when you get your follow-up to this chat, I will have that information on there for you, as well as a link to either listen or watch this webinar later.
Perfect.
So awesome. Great to see you, Dino.
Great to see you both as well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Dino. And thank all of you, especially for your comments. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we do really appreciate them and read them. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.
Okay.
Bye.